This is the Tesla Model Y, the best-selling EV in America. It weighs 4,388 pounds and has over 10,000 parts. The most important parts in the car are in the rear drive unit. This unit weighs 194 pounds, less than 5% of the total weight of the car. But inside that unit, deep in the rotor of the rear motors, you'll find the real secret: magnets. These magnets generate the magnetic field that helps produce torque in the motor shaft. And buried inside those magnets, just 1.1 pounds of it is the magic ingredient: rare earth metals. Only 0.02% the weight of the Tesla Model Y. And without them, the car would be less powerful, less efficient, more expensive, and more complex. 1.1 pounds and a world of difference. So where do these rare earth metals even come from? About 70% of all rare earth production comes from China, with the US representing 11.6%. But it gets worse. These metals require significant refining that is energy-intensive and heavily polluting. China represents 92% of refined material production globally. That means China controls whether or not the world has an EV revolution. But it's not just EVs. Military equipment, data centers, and dozens of other high-technology applications rely on tiny bits of rare earth. Without them, the US is disadvantaged. And Trump, he knows this. As does China. On October 9, 2025, China published Announcement No. 62 of 2025. In it, they introduced new rules that require foreign companies to gain approval to export products where rare earths account for just 0.1% of the goods' total value. President Trump reacted swiftly. He threatened to impose an additional 100% tariff on Chinese goods. This is how China turned dirt into dominance. Rare earth minerals are 17 metallic elements at the bottom of the periodic table that are crucial for modern technology. Everything from phones, EVs, wind turbines, fighter jets, they all need these minerals. Like we mentioned before, a Tesla Model Y has about 0.5 kilograms of rare earth compared to its total weight of around 1,884 kilograms. Although small in quantity, the impact is massive. And unlike most of the world, China saw this coming decades ago. As recently as 1991, the US was the leading global supplier of rare earths. This was all thanks to the Mountain Pass mine in California, but more on that later. Since then, China has become the dominant player. Take a look at these charts. Like mentioned before, China currently represents 70% of all rare earth production, with the US far behind at just 11.6%. But don't these minerals need to be processed? Well, like we showed before, China represents 92% of refined material production globally. And demand is expected to increase from 91 knots in 2024 to 150 knots by 2040. In other words, China dominates the one mineral that the modern world can't live without. But how did we get from the US being the global leader to China having a near monopoly on rare earths? Let's get into it. During the Cold War, China was watching the US closely. They learned that rare earths were the backbone of some of America's most important industries. They were essential in petroleum refining, precision hardware, metallurgy, and most importantly, military hardware. China understood that if it were to ever compete against the US, it would need to develop a strong military capability, an insurance policy of sorts. So in 1975, China established the National Rare Earth Development and Application Leading Group. This led to a meaningful ramp-up of research and development funding. As part of this, China sent over scientists and geologists to visit the US Mountain Pass mine, the largest rare earth mine at the time. The CEO of Molycorp, a processing company at Mountain Pass, was quoted saying, "We toured them, we explained what we do, allowed them to take pictures, and everything else. They studied ore composition, mine design, processing techniques, and more. In fact, they even took rock samples home. The US thought nothing of it. In fact, they welcomed Chinese researchers as they believed this would help China on its path to democracy and global trade partnership. And how can you blame them? Rare earths were and remain a small segment of mining. Businessman Mitchell Presnick recalls a meeting with a Chinese mining company in the 90s. This is what he said: "They knew that rare earths were more important than we seemed to be acting like. As a result, China used its newfound knowledge to identify similar mineralization at the Bay Nobo site in Inner Mongolia, a site that would become the dominant rare earth mine globally." But it went further than touring sites. The Chinese needed the know-how to make the most important product from rare earths: magnets. In 1995, the U.S. government approved the sale of Magnalquench, the rare earths and magnet division of General Motors. Who was it sold to? A group of Chinese companies. Initially, they maintained the U.S. factories, but they rapidly built up factories in China and eventually shuttered all U.S. facilities, shifting the capacity, know-how, and innovation to China. Brilliant. What could go wrong? Based on everything we have said so far, China's approach seems perfectly calculated and centrally planned. But that's not completely true. In 1991, China passed a law calling rare earths strategic. This restricted foreign companies from working with Chinese companies. At around the same time, it introduced tax rebates to encourage domestic production. The race was on, and Chinese cowboys were lined up. The industry was highly unregulated and crowded with small mines and refineries viciously competing. This drove down prices so aggressively that business made no sense. Not only was it bad for business, but it was terrible for the environment. They would scar the earth and paid very little mind to practices related to structural stability, environmental management, and more. It got so bad that a Chinese media investigation in 2012 compared the rare earths industry in China to the trafficking of illegal drugs. China attempted many times to wrangle the industry, but local governments were drunk on mining revenues. But as it became increasingly apparent that rare earths were the future, the Chinese government had had enough. Starting in 2011, authorities were instructed to audit mines unannounced, seize assets, destroy legal mines, and more. Within 4 years, China went from dozens of small players to only 6 supersized firms, nicknamed the Big Six. This consolidation had a number of benefits. For one, the government had an easier time tracking extraction, production, and exports all across the country. This basically destroyed the smuggling that previously accounted for 30% of China's rare earth product. But most importantly, this created an oligopoly that could unilaterally control prices. To put it in perspective, OPEC controls around 40% of global oil production. China controls 90% of refined rare earth production. When it comes to rare earths, it's China's world and we're just living in it. Real quick, we have a free Discord community where we talk about economics, politics. You can debate with us, we're actually in there, we message quite often, so join, link in the bio, and make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to the video. Any objective observer would agree that China was super thoughtful in cementing its rare earth dominance. But China had a helping hand from the West, obviously unintentionally. We already mentioned that the US let Chinese scientists study at their most important mine, and how they let Chinese companies buy an extremely sophisticated company and shift all IP abroad. But what we didn't mention is how the West all by itself helped bury the rare earth industry. In 2005, China tightened exports of rare earths, driving prices up. This made it increasingly difficult for defense companies and automakers to reliably access cheap raw materials. In fact, Molycorp actually tried reviving Mountain Pass to introduce domestically manufactured magnets back to the US, and it made sense. Prices of rare earths were high enough for US companies to be profitable.